What if hidden inside ancient texts were teachings about consciousness, light, the soul, spiritual ascension, and inner awakening that most people were never taught how to recognize? Today, I want to talk about something called Pistis Sophia. And honestly, the deeper I read this text, the more I realized this is not just mythology. This is symbolic psychology, cosmic consciousness, encoded spiritual philosophy. Once you start seeing the symbolism, you cannot unsee it. Pistis Sophia is an ancient Gnostic text. The word pistis means faith, trust, spiritual knowing, and Sophia means wisdom. So together, it represents wisdom through spiritual understanding. But this text goes much deeper than religion. It speaks about light, consciousness, dimensions of reality, inner transformation, spiritual awakening, the journey of the soul. And one thing that immediately stood out to me was how often it talks about light. Throughout the text, light is treated as intelligence, consciousness, divine awareness, truth itself. And this becomes really interesting because almost every civilization connected enlightenment with light. Even today, we say, I had an awakening, I finally see, that opened my eyes, or that illuminated me. Why? Because human consciousness naturally associates awareness with light. Darkness represents unconsciousness. Light represents awareness. And Pistis Sophia constantly points back to this. One line that stood out to me was this idea, the first mystery. And honestly, I think this is where the hidden gold begins. If these teachings were meaningless, why were they pushed outside mainstream religion in the first place? Why were some interpretations protected while others became dangerous? Because the first mystery is described almost like the source of existence, the origin point, the invisible intelligence behind reality itself. Not an old man in the sky, but something much deeper. Almost like the field of consciousness, the source mind, the intelligence behind creation. And this reminds me of something important. Ancient texts often spoke symbolically because symbolism survives time. Science changes language. Civilizations collapse. But symbols survive forever. This is why I believe that so many spiritual texts sound strange when read literally. Because they were never only literal. They were layered, symbolic, encoded. Almost like consciousness speaking through story. And once you understand that, the Bible, Egyptian mythology, Gnostic teachings, Hermetic teachings start overlapping in really interesting ways. Not because they copied each other necessarily, but because they were all trying to describe consciousness, creation, the human experience, the nature of reality, using the language available at that time. One thing I personally believe is that Pistis Sophia is describing an inner spiritual journey, not just outer cosmology. The soul falls into confusion, searches for truth, moves through suffering, learns discernment, and slowly returns toward light. Honestly, that sounds a lot like awakening itself. Because real awakening is not aesthetic. It is not love and light 24/7. It's confronting illusions, seeing your conditioning, recognizing your unconscious patterns, separating truth from programming. That is the real journey. And this is where I think this becomes deeply relevant today. Because modern societies keep people externally focused constantly. More distraction, more noise, more stimulation, more consumption. But ancient teachings repeatedly pointed inward. Know thyself, awaken, observe, become conscious. And that is powerful. Because once a person becomes conscious, they become harder to manipulate. Now, some people interpret parts of Gnostic teachings literally and others symbolically. Personally, I think many of the lower forces can also represent things like your fear, your ego, your unconscious programming, your addiction to materialism, emotional cycles, internal chaos. Because what controls most people? Not demons, patterns, conditioning, unconsciousness. And honestly, that is scarier. I think texts like Pistis Sophia feel forbidden to people because they encourage direct spiritual exploration, not blind obedience, not fear. Exploration, questioning, awareness, inner transformation. And systems throughout history have always been uncomfortable with people who think deeply. Because aware people become difficult to control. And honestly, the more I study ancient symbolism, the more I realize I don't think these texts were trying to scare humanity. I think they were trying to wake humanity up. Fear replaced understanding, literalism replaced symbolism, and control replaced wisdom. That's why I think many people feel disconnected from spirituality today. Because deep down, they can feel there's something meaningful there, but the interpretation feels incomplete. The biggest thing I want people to understand is this. You do not have to blindly believe everything, but you should become curious, because curiosity is the beginning of consciousness. And once you start looking behind the words, behind the symbols, behind the stories, you begin realizing ancient teachings may have been pointing toward consciousness, awareness, energy, inner transformation, and the evolution of the human mind far more than most people realize. Maybe the real hidden knowledge was never meant to make people fearful. Maybe it was meant to make people aware of themselves, aware of consciousness, aware of the patterns shaping reality. And maybe the real awakening begins the moment you stop blindly consuming information and start deeply observing it. Because once you truly begin seeking, you'll start seeing the symbolism everywhere.